So thank you guys for coming. Today we are going to talk about using a library called Valtio for state management in React. I also like to think of it as like a class of state management libraries called atomic state management. Some of those other kind of libraries similar would be Recoil, et cetera. But we'll get through all of that in today's presentation. Before we kind of get started with the rest of it, I assume most of you are React developers today. It's probably why you're interested in this talk. Okay. Since there's a small enough group of you, I just love if you go around, if you're willing to tell me, like, what do you use today in production, and what, or if you've used something else that's not at your company that you prefer, what would it be? You just want to start, starting with you because you're actually eating.
We just mainly use context for like low-level stuff, but for other places we do use Redux.
Redux, okay.
Redux and Redux toolkit query.
Okay.
Redux.
Redux. Redux.
Now I'm using Redux and Redux toolkit.
Yeah.
Before I used Jotai.
Jotai, okay.
Redux.
Redux. Redux.
Sagna.
Redux.
Redux.
Redux, okay, cool. Redux.
Redux.
Redux. Oh, wow.
Is this similar to Mobix a bit?
No. Mobx is a sort of more reactive version, but this is basically, okay, the way I'm going to say this is kind of obviously I'm talking about this library because I like it. To me, this is what Redux should be. It's like, it's very easy to understand because it basically is Redux without all the boilerplate, because I never quite understood, like all the stuff Redux toolkit tries to solve, it's like, why do we even need this anyways, right? And it's often a very academic reason that you need these action creators, but they're like, why? So the creator of this, if you guys have used, someone said they use Jotai someplace? Jotai, okay. Jotai, Zeuston, and this library are largely the same maintainer. And he's kind of a... Jotai, yeah. J-O, I don't know how he pronounces it. But it's actually almost all the same maintainer, part of the open collective. A guy named, at least his GitHub username is Daishi, and he is like a prolific maintainer, like incredibly fast, responsive, and he just kind of maintains all these things. I don't know how he does it. But also, I should update this more, but if you want to find like this talk and other talks afterwards, Riaz, I mean, we're quickly going around and just saying like if we're using Redux or React in production today, what are we using for state management?
Some applications Redux, personal project system.
Okay, cool, awesome. All right, so I'll move on to the next slide. A little blurb about me. So I currently live in Toronto. I flew down here. I'm senior director at a company called Waste Dynamics, which is, can explain what they do. It's kind of a fascinating, kind of a niche business within the waste industry. But I used to live here, so I actually am from here. I went to high school here. My parents still live here. My cousins still live here. I come down here a lot. I've been doing Connect Tech Talks for a few years. I think, so I actually knew Pratik from before I think even Connect Tech was maybe started. Like when I was a very junior dev, he had an office space that was next to mine. The Pratik is the sort of main primary organizer of the conference. But I also found that like I share a love of label makers and spreadsheets that very few other people do. My wife gave me a label maker for my birthday, like an upgraded label maker, and I was so proud because then I took the last label of my previous label maker and it had label maker as the label, and I put it on the new label maker, and I realized it's going to be a tradition when I cycle label makers. And I also love anything that Mark Manson writes. If you guys know that he wrote a couple famous books sort of in that genre, but that's basically my entire personality, spreadsheets and Mark Manson. So the other thing that you guys might be interested in, this is kind of Toronto-based, but we become increasingly virtual and national, is I run sort of an independent tech community. Who here is part of like Tech 404 if you're local or have heard of Tech 404, right? So it's kind of like that, but it's sort of become more global and national. We have all sorts of virtual panel talks, in-person stuff in Toronto. We do mock interview practice. We do like mob pair programming. There's like 1,000 events that are occurring all the time. So if you want to join us, that's the kind of URL to our website. And you can join the Slack community or LinkedIn. It's just a good collection of devs. If you ever get stuck, ask questions. It's become a bit more active than we ever expected. So, all right, what are we going to actually talk about in the rest of this talk? So first, we're just going to go at a really high level of like existing state management libraries, which I think for this audience is not going to be new because you guys are already in the space, but you can kind of see what my perspective is on them to know why I think we need to do something different. Then we'll go over what Valtio is as a library. We'll talk at a brief level about how it works at a primitive level that's a bit different than other libraries. And then I'm going to do some live coding because I'm going to show you some code, but it never really quite attaches. We're just going to start with like a code sandbox, blank, and we are going to do it wild. We are going to go and just code from scratch in a sandbox and actually use Valtio from scratch, from a blank slate. Well, if we have time, we'll do that. You guys are a good audience. So if we think about current state, right? The reason we have this problem at all is that React is fundamentally a view-only framework. Now, some people disagree with me on this, but like it was in the 1.0 release that like we are solving the V part of the MVC problem. They weren't like Ember, Angular at the time back in the day where they wanted to solve other problems. And the reason we have all these libraries is because they don't solve it. They don't give us the way that Vue has Vuex, and like pretty much any Vue project you ever use is going to use Vuex. In React, probably the most popular one is Redux, right? That's why we have this whole audience. However, there's 1,000 solutions, and Redux is still probably, I think from my tracking, from when I looked at some metrics, it's only a third of projects, right? So we have to kind of figure this out on our own. The gods of React have not given us a solution. But some people say use state is a solution for this, right? Because that is the primitive that's been foundational, at least from a context or a hook perspective, it's built in. Well, pre-hooks too, but use state being the hook variant. But I find it's kind of problematic. One, it's really coupled. So one, it doesn't batch update. So if you have like 2 or 3 things, if you're even, let's say, tracking an API call, loading true, error true, what the data is, those sequential calls will cause multiple re-renders, multiple updates to state.
What about React 18?
Yeah, I think they do solve for that a little bit, but it still has some of the other problems in terms of like you're still coupled to where you invoked state, right? So it's bound to a specific component, and any sort of nested components or other parts of your application have to continuously have that as a property passed to it, right? Either the setter or the actual data itself. But yeah, you're right. React 18 has some solutions to this. Use context, again, I could go through this code. I feel like this is pretty self-explanatory because I was expecting a few people in the audience to be like, I'm a Vue developer, but you guys all understand and probably used use state before. So this code example kind of is pretty simplistic. But the bigger kind of point I wanted to point out was like, in order for that lower component to have access to that data as well as be able to set any data, you had to pass it as a prop. That's really the main point. Use context. So it again was a solution that I think we got primarily with more recent versions of React, and I think there was an initial kind of enthusiasm being like, oh, this is going to solve the problem because now it's not coupled to a particular part of the tree. You can have a provider at the top, and the provider can then be attached at any sort of subtree if you don't want to keep passing all the props down. However, the way context is designed, if any part of the context changes, essentially the whole thing causes a re-render for everything that's using that particular provider. So it was great for things like light, dark themes, where you're okay for a massive re-render, but if you're hypothetically tracking like a form input on every single character, you don't want a massive re-render. And I've seen these applications in real life where people have used context as a global state, and it's like you do anything, and the entire application flashes, It still has the problem of component coupling, right? It's still kind of tied to particular top level where you want to invoke your provider and then the subcomponents below it. So if you don't want to have everything in one master kind of context, you can't quite, if you've kind of mounted it in this tree, it's only things within that provider that can actually listen for pieces of it. And so yeah, the code example is just an example. I also kind of find it a little bit verbose. I mean, you have to sort of like at the top level create something in state and then pass it in as a value to the provider, which can then be like listened to in the sub. It's actually not the cleanest implementation for things where you have a lot of usage of context. Other libraries, right? I could go through every single one of these, right, and explain where I think there's some things they all do well and some things they do poorly, but the example here is that there's a lot of options, right? Now, Redux being the one that a lot of us use here, and of course, Redux with Redux Toolkit is way nicer to use than Redux without Redux Toolkit, but like, and even in here, there's twists on this, which is like Apollo Client is not a state management library, but it has the ability for you to track client state. SWR, which is stale while revalidate, which is a library that for different talk, it's for declarative data fetching. But the reason it's kind of considered state management is a lot of people are only using state management in order to track the response from an API call. So you can maybe solve that problem and you don't need much else. So every single one of these takes a different approach to solving all of these problems. And my perspective on it is that, like, while I like some of them, I don't think that for most of us, the reason, let's say, all this audience is using Redux is because they don't particularly solve the problem very cleanly. And they're not, the funniest one to me is Recoil, because it's actually by Facebook. How many of you have heard of Recoil, have ever tried it before? Okay, so I'll just tell the story to the rest of you. Facebook says, oh, this is a problem. We have this concept of atomic state management. So instead of having a big Redux store, you have little pieces of state that are tracked outside of your React component. So they launch a project, but they put it under a GitHub org called Facebook Experimental. And then they launched it as like a 0 dot something. And it actually kind of was good. Like in some ways, some pieces of it worked really well. Now, how many years, like 5 or 6 years later, it's still under Facebook Experimental. It's used by, like, GitHub says 65,000 projects are using it. So it's, people were like, it's by Facebook, we should use this, right? The documentation is meh, it's failing CI. Like, it gets an update once every 6 months of like a package update, and everyone was like, what the hell, man? And it's sort of like the same story as like Create React App, which is like half abandonware at this point, where people still use it and it's so popular, but Facebook has not just said, oh yeah, we're gonna provide, you can use other solutions, but here's an officially supported solution. And that's where it looked like it was going when it launched. But we've been failed by the gods of Facebook. So it's still kind of a, yeah. And some of the new stuff they launched, they kind of half-assed it. That was launched after those primitives. Anyways, so what is Valtio? So Valtio is the idea of using a JavaScript concept called a proxy. How many of you have heard of JavaScript proxies, like ES6 proxies? Okay. Now, I'm going to admit to you that, like, I love the usage of Valtio, but I've never used a proxy directly in JavaScript outside of the context of Valtio, right? So some of you, if you have used it, that's what it's doing. And we're going to talk a little bit about sort of proxies, and I'll link you to the MDN article to like really understand. Like, this is just a thing in ES6 that's just a feature that we can use. But that QR code will just take you to the GitHub page because, again, fundamentally what you could start looking at yourself. But if we think, what is Valtio, like what really matters about it? So it's proxy-based, which means it uses JavaScript native proxies under the hood to create observable state objects. So it's taking something that's native to JavaScript. You're not doing some fancy meta DSL library thing. And it uses the concept of immutable state. So when you read from it, the data you're getting out is immutable, and it can then, because it's a snapshot of immutable state, every change will cause your components to re-render, right? Whatever you bind to it. And when state objects, whenever you change any piece of a proxy, you create like a new snapshot automatically, just like Redux, right? But it's doing all that boilerplate for you under the hood because it's built into proxies. And also, the boilerplate is very minimal, like almost non-existent. And I think the conceptual idea behind it was, now that we have TypeScript, right? Like this notion of these predefined action creators that change state in a particular way to define, here's the parameters, here's the type of change I made. Effectively, you get the value of that through TypeScript, right? If you're using TypeScript, and it is fully typed. All right, so let's just talk about JavaScript proxies real quick. You said, I think only one of you raised your hand saying you kind of understood what it is. So it is a part of the JavaScript spec. It's implemented for a long time. It's not a new feature. But essentially what it is, like they invented it because who remembers back in the day the problem of like JavaScript being prototype based and people would mess with the prototype of a thing to add functionality to something? Right, okay. So that's why they came up with this, which was like, okay, that's a pattern we need to basically say, we want to talk to a thing, but we want like an interceptor that can add functionality in between. And so that's what a proxy is. It's literally proxying calls. So it's just an object that wraps another object or function and intercepts its fundamental operations, such as property access, assignment, invocation, and more. So so maybe let's think brass tacks. Now that QR code, I'm explaining it very poorly. It's like kind of a conceptual mindfuck. So read the MDN article. That's actually very good of like, hey, if we had this, here's a problem, and here's how a proxy solves that problem. But let's look at the code sample. And this is pretty much taken from that MDN article because they do a pretty good job. You just have an object at the top. You define a function in the middle with a get, right? That's a magic thing in JavaScript, the getter of a property, right? And it's going to take the target, the prop, and the receiver, and it says, hey, if the property I got was message2, then return world. And I'm not going to explain reflect. It's just to make sure that you're be able to, it is a function that defines the default get. It's almost like calling super to make sure that if it's not a matching property, it's doing what it's supposed to have done originally. But then when you create a proxy with that particular target, saying the first thing is what is the raw data, and the handler is the function. So then when you say proxy dot message to below, the reason it returns world instead of everyone is in that middle, that handler is intercepting it, right? And saying, hey, the property is message to, therefore return world. So the handler essentially came in the middle of it returning the original property. Does that kind of make sense if you look at that code, right? Okay. So I'm going to make that bigger. I forgot I put the slide in there because I was like, it might be hard to read. Any questions on this? Because this is kind of important to understand at some level. Of course, there's a lot of other stuff about proxies, but to be like, you could have done like target.message2, and of course you're always going to get everyone, right? But in this case, you put a handler in between that is intercepting that call. Now, if you did this as like a plain object, you could, but the idea is like to the rest of your entire application, that proxy looks like a regular JavaScript object. It doesn't know that there's a handler. It doesn't think, it works, interops perfectly with anything that takes a regular JavaScript object. But behind the scenes, there's logic in the middle to be able to compute that property. Almost in some ways, like conceptually, think of it like a selector, right? The selectors try to memoize data, but like, you know, a selector can kind of like intercept and then be able to, do something in the middle before returning a value. Okay. So why does this matter? So one, it means that Valtio being a plain proxy under the hood and not some special React hook thing means you can use it in plain JavaScript or hook it to React or hook it to anything. You can do subscribe functions, you can do, and you can literally use it in just plain JavaScript, not even in React, right? You can even use it on the back end if you want to. And it also means you can reuse these in legacy class components. So some of the newer libraries are very bound to functional components. If you work on a legacy project where they're still migrating some stuff, you can use it anywhere. But this is probably the first time you're going to see any Valtio code, right? So you import their proxy and a snapshot. So if you created a proxy with that data, so in line 3 there, that name equals Mika is effectively your target, right? That's your initial values. And you create a store. Now, then you can extract data. You can read data whenever you want using the snapshot function. So you get back a copy of the data inside of it. So then snap1 basically is name Mika. Snapshot 2 is, again, the exact same copy of data. And then if 1 will equal 2, so it will never re-render. Now, what I mean by it's the same data, it's not a different object with the same properties. It is the same object under the hood. If you ever do like object comparison in JavaScript, you know how it's like 2 different objects that even though they look the same, they can equate differently? No, these are immutable. When you read the snapshot, it is the same place in memory under the hood.
So they're the same point. So I guess the question, are they 2 different, snap 1 and snap 2, are they 2 unique variables? Like, are they 2 different objects that just have the same values, or are they like
No, they're
pointers pointing to the same?
they're 2 pointers. Effectively, they're 2 pointers pointing to the same thing. Like you can use equals, not the rough equal. Like they will always equate to the exact same thing under the hood, even from a shallow comparison, not a deep comparison. Yeah.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
I watched things I was talking to it. So the benefit of that is that when we bind this to React, which we're not doing in this particular example, that means React doesn't have to do any fancy thing. It will not re-render, right? Because even if you bind multiple times, it doesn't do that weird thing React sometimes does where you pass functions or objects as props, right? And it'll be like, this is different, even though it's actually a deep comparison would make it equal. You don't have to worry about any of that. Now, changing a part of that name is simply a dot accessor. This is the part I love, right? You see that line 10, store.name equals? Now think of Redux. Think of, although they've made it more efficient, it's like, I want to change some part of my state, and it used to be, it's like, you need an action creator, and you need a reducer, and you need all of this stuff, and 99% of the time, those actions and reducers are just a name to pass in a value and a reducer that just sets that same value, right? It was like a very simple thing you were trying to do, but a lot of boilerplate to get it. Now, stored up by using an accessor like dot under the hood, they're proxying, right? They're able to intercept that set call and then do the underlying stuff that Valtio wants to do to track that change. But to you, it looks like a simple dot accessor.
So can you say that on line 4 and on line 6, the variables are the same reference?
Yeah, they are. Yeah. Yep. Now that it's changed on line 11, when we get a snapshot again, they don't equal because they're actually different. The data is different, and they're actually different points in memory now.
You get a different reference on
Line 12, yeah, or line 11, correct, yeah. Okay, now let's look at how does this actually work in React world, right? So there's really two pieces. You're either changing data or you're reading data, right? Reading data means your component showing some piece of your state, and you want it to automatically re-render every time that state changes. So now again, I generally don't put proxies all in one line. Like this is in reality a simplified example. I usually put the proxy, the data stuff in a separate file, right? But of course in our example, it's all just inline here. So we have a person state proxy. You can make as many proxies as you want, right? You can have like, I typically do a pattern of 1 per page, right? 1 per route. And then I may have a global state proxy. So it's not all mixed into one parent global thing. You can just create them as you need them on the side. And anything across your application can bind to them. But in this example, we have a person state and an auth state. And you can actually pass one proxy into the other. And it just handles that magically. So in the very first one, auth state.user.name returns Timo. And then if you set Nina, you would get Nina. So you can compose your proxies, and you can essentially, this is really a set. We'll talk about the read in just a second. But like I said, it just looks like your application code is just plain objects, right? And just setters. Behind the scenes, the proxy is keeping track. It's intercepting these calls you're making and keeping track of all the stuff that really matters under the hood. The other thing that's really cool, and this is not in this example, imagine you had auth state.user, like imagine this is a handler function like an onClick, right? Like onClick, change it to Nina or something like that, and change the role from admin to member, right? And so you had two sequential calls. Like imagine line 15 was inside that handle click function, and you had set the name to Nina, and then the line right below it, you had auth state.user.role equals member, right? In the world of some other state management libraries, including in Redux, and yes, React 18 has changed some of the stuff if the libraries have implemented it, that would cause two different re-renders because the first one would occur, re-render, second one would occur, re-render, right? Or you have to do something to make it batch. This automatically keeps track of all synchronous changes that were made at the same time and batches them to one re-render, and you don't have to do anything. Like it keeps track of the next async tick. So if I make 7 updates to 7 different proxies, it actually knows that, can see that those all occurred synchronously in one line with no async calls or change between them, and your app will re-render once. But you don't have to think about that in your code. Yeah, and it just sort of, it's not really magic. It's just because it's receiving all these calls, right? And it only applies the changes on like the next tick. And the next tick will occur on the next async sort of action. So it'll either occur automatically or like on the next async action, which blew my mind because I had this problem with use state all the time where I would like try to track stuff and you try to make 2 or 3 updates and you're like, the app is rendering once, then twice, then 3 times, right? All right, this is where the other part of it, reading state, right? Like binding a React component to show what's in that proxy. And the first part's the exact same, but starting on line 14, you'll see that's literally how you just show anything in your app. You just say use snapshot, use their hook, and then you can bind to any part of the state. You could bind to all of auth state, the user, or just the name. Here's the cool part. You see how it's binding to name down there? The Timo. If some other thing changed, like if some other handler changed, let's say the state blah blah dot role equals member, this will not re-render. Even though on line 16, right, we're binding to, we're kind of, what's the word, deconstructing? I forgot the word for it, decomposing. Shit, what's the word for that? Destructuring, right. So we're kind of like, we're binding to that whole user, but it's smart enough because because it's a proxy, it's keeping track of the fact that only the name property was finally accessed in the render. So like you can have even these big objects, and if you're only kind of using some small part of it in a component, that thing will automatically never re-render unless that one little property was changed, because it's keeping track behind the hood based on a proxy what was actually used or not used in that particular instance. Which again blew my mind, because before it would be if you kind of bind to the whole thing, it always re-renders even if that one thing you're using didn't change, if you use plain React. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, this is a gotcha, because remember, it's the dot accessor, right? That's the accessor that's actually causing it to pay attention. So if I made a proxy, and again, subscribe is an example here of the plain version of doing it. You can subscribe to hearing updates that are completely outside of React, just binding to changes. But if you look there on line 11, right, I'm reassigning to a new object, and I'm not saying, state.user.name equals Nina. I'm just setting it right to that object, and that's not going to work. All you've just done is taken what was the proxy, and you've essentially just made it a regular plain object, right? You have to use a dot accessor to say I'm sending a message that the name should be this, and it's intercepting that and making a change. So, don't use equals. Just use the accessor property. Does that make sense? Okay. So yeah, instead you want to mutate the object. That would be the equivalent. Line 11, just use the accessor property. Which in reality is what we would all do, but if you're just oh, I just need to set this thing, in other libraries you might be able to set, or if you're using, because even in useState you would have to use set whatever. So hopefully you're not doing that. All right, one more cool thing. It works with the DevTools. The problem is I'm going to show you, I could show this to you, but essentially, you import their DevTools from utils, and you can say what you want the name and if it's enabled, and you get the exact same functionality as DevTools. All of that state, right, that was in there in our previous example, the count and text will show up as a property, and what will happen is if it's batching your updates for you, the action will automatically be named, we updated this, and this property, and it'll be one batched update, and you'll get the exact same interop with your DevTools. Now the only thing is, if you have 5 proxies on a page, which I wouldn't recommend, seems too complex, you probably have a global proxy and a page per proxy kind of thing. You're not looking at the selector that you have, in Redux of auto select instance. You have to manually say which one you want to inspect, because they are independent proxies. They're independent stores. But yes, you get to work with the DevTools just like today. For all you Redux fans. This is actually huge. To me, it's actually, because that was the main pro, that other libraries don't have really good debuggers the way Redux DevTools is. But it works with every feature in DevTools. All right, so the second part of this presentation is we're just going to say, hey, I showed you some code examples. Let's just kind of play with it. And that's what I love about one. Any of you seen me give a talk before? I love living dangerously, so I enjoy the live coding kind of part. And then it'll fail, and then we'll all kind of point out what the typo is and fix it. So I'll send this out afterwards. There won't have any links. There's some docs. There's a really good explanation by the maintainer about how all this works. The docs are just so simple. The README is the docs. I mean, there's just not much else you need to know. But what we are going to do, how do I get out of this? Here, I'm just going to close this. Wait, did I close all of Chrome? No. Ah, there we go. Oh, I closed my actual thing I want to show you. Edit this out. Why can I not get out of full screen? Exit full screen. Okay. So I made one because I want to know this is actually going to work, but we're going to start from pure scratch. Start with the React one. And yeah, this is plain React, right? So we are just going to add Valtio into this little tool. And we're just going to import, say, proxy, we'll need that, and we'll need to use snapshot from Valtio. Install module. Okay, so we still see the rest of our page. So we are going to state equals proxy, and we'll just do a counter for right now, right? We'll just do count 0. You can put, by the way, you can put objects as your values. They don't have to be primitives. It also understands that pretty well. You can have nested objects if you want to, and it'll proxy at every layer for you. So we could have done yeah, we'll just do it that way. right? And then here, we will just do const. Okay. Does this make sense? Is that still visible to you guys? Still readable? Just helps us kind of see more. Yeah, okay. Makes sense to everyone, right? We just made a thing, put some data in it, and then we bound to it here, right? So it's actually showing in our app. And we want to increment this, so we just do like button. You know what? I'm also going to show you something that I always do. You know how right now most of your handlers are probably, if you're using a lot of hooks, like you have to kind of define like your handler, like let's say like const handle click equals whatever, right? Because you want it bound to whatever's in the component, and then you have to use callback to make sure it's not constantly generating new functions if you want to improve your efficiency. Well, because like our handler, our update calls, like in this case to increment the count, is just a plain accessor on this state object, which is defined outside of our component. You get a lot of performance improvements by like you just do generally something like, let's say, bump 1, and you can put this in a util file anywhere outside of the React context, so it's not generating at runtime. And you can do state.data.count 1. So the point I was making was the fact that that bump 1 function is not actually ever defined in the React context means it is just a plain function. It's compiled at runtime. It's optimized at runtime. At build time. It can never magically get regenerated or cause like re-renders because it's generating kind of like inside your component. You can put it in a utils file next to your component, not have like your actual your component render function like littered with all these use callbacks, use memos of functions you're having to define in line. It becomes truly like what React kind of promised us as a one-way data flow. What did I do wrong? Oh, handle click is not defined. No, I should actually, wrong one, bump 1. Okay, right. So it kind of looks like use state in a way, right? It just looks like basically state that's not inside the component, right? But if I had this defined, for example, in like a file next to this called like my page proxy, I can bind to this or add to it from any subcomponent I have. Like I don't have to pass anything, right? I can have a subcomponent that just also imports this function and does it. Any part of my entire application that wants to use this count can simply just import state from a different file. Like this could be in a different file and just be exported. So my state, just like in Redux land, right? One of the benefits is your state is separate from your application. So if you're refactoring components and rechanging the hierarchy, if you're doing things like in use state, you're like, oh shit, no, it's defined at this level, so now I got to move that to a higher level so that these two components can be passed it. You get the same benefit as Redux. So it is just like boilerplate-less Redux in some ways. And these proxies can be as sophisticated or as simple as possible. You can do effectively what are selectors, which I'm not going to do live. I guess I could. I think it's called derive. Yeah. Yeah, so they actually support all the new fancy stuff. You can support like suspend. So yeah, if you're actually having to track input values, I'll zoom in a bit of this. React has its own synthetic event system that causes input updates to be passed. Basically, if you're setting values on change, you have to kind of make sure you're reading it in a synchronous way. Otherwise, it won't update the value because React actually does some interference there. They've just kind of thought of all the like main ways you might need to use this, and it's a very practical library. So there it is, computed properties. Oh, the derive thing I was telling you about, actually they've deprecated that now. Now they've simplified that syntax even further. Your selectors effectively are just like an annotation. So you think of like selectors and some of the complexity you have to do around that. Boom, that's literally your entire syntax for adding like a computed property off of an existing property.
do we have memoization of some sort?
Yeah, well, this is memoized. Because unless count changes, so doubled gets computed at the point of the snapshot being generated, right? Like if I made the count 2, that would automatically run the doubled and make it 4. So when I access doubled, it is not recomputing it. It is computed with the snapshot. So it's computed when the snap changes, and then anytime you read it 100 times, it's never recomputing. Because it knows the only way for it to change is if count changes. I don't use this, but you could. There's all sorts of like really cool advanced behaviors that they've been adding. The other thing I like is that the maintainer has made an ESLint plugin. So if you're using it wrong and doing some of those gotchas I told you about, you'll essentially get yelled at by the plugin, which is just fantastic. These two are the big ones that are the two gotchas that people will get wrong and will kind of make it work unpredictably. Yeah, I have really, really enjoyed it, and it's been a very, so my wife, who is not at this conference, I think a few of you might, well, you know her, she, based on what I was doing, introduced it at her company, I don't know where my actual presentation is. Just do start presenting, that's all that. She introduced it at her company because they have like kind of a mess of just all sorts of stuff. And they ended up finding they could very incrementally adopt this. And they just have this really, I think they were using some sort of like higher order component thing. And so everything had to be wrapped with this higher order component that could give them access to the user data. And then they incrementally started adopting this. And it's just a simple library that kind of does the basics you need, that for the most part doesn't get in the way. And it's been pretty rock solid. So the maintainer, same guy, Zustand and Jotai. And there's like never more than like 3 open issues. Like he responds like within an hour to anything that gets opened and either resolves it or fixes the bug. So in many ways, like I did this talk and a bunch of people in my company are using it. And I kind of like was like, how do I talk about this for this long? Because for the most part, like we haven't had that many issues and like no one complains about it, which is to me ideal. Like people just use it now and just assume it just works. And like we just haven't had any like, we kind of give them like an hour to get introduced to it and they just sort of use it and it sort of stays out of the way. All right, that's all I have for the presentation part. Any questions? Yeah.
I forgot for a moment, but I actually use React Query and I really love React Query. What do you think React Query, or what does Valtio have over React Query?
So the big one is that React Query, which I guess is now called TanStack Query, or SWR, they are solving a different problem. But I think React Query, TanStack Query has a way for you to store your own state in it as well, right? Okay. So have any of you used like a declarative fetching library, TanStack Query, SWR, et cetera? Okay, a few of you. So the rest of you don't understand. Basically, a lot of people are using any of these state management solutions to just say, okay, I need a query, an endpoint, get some data and set it. So your state management is loading true, false, error from the API call true, false, and then the resulting data, right? And you're doing that over and over and over again across like 20 parts of your application. So SWR, TanStack Query, they make that declarative where like you have a hook essentially that has a fetcher function, and then like you get back essentially, it computes the automatic loading, error, and data object for you, so you don't have to write all that boilerplate over and over and over again. So the benefit is, like I've used often Valtio, not in our current project, in conjunction with that, where that fits, and it's just I'm just storing the response from an API call, especially a GET call. That's great, but I find that it's way simpler, and we have way fewer bugs than using like either that or like Apollo clients built-in data storage. Like they're actually not designed for storing your own state, and it's kind of complex and buggy at times. And they have really, at least Apollo client is really bad backwards compatibility with that stuff. So where you have your own state for your application, store it in something like Valtio. But if you like a declarative fetching library, use it where it makes sense. They both play nicely together. So, yeah.
This kind of process methodology, how do you compare it to something like, I guess, Zustand being the observable kind of thing? Like,
Zustand has some similar opinions. Yeah, it's kind of funny that like the same maintainer maintains all of these. So I think this is his more popular library. But for those of you that don't know, like you create a store and then you have sort of some, like in some ways this kind of looks weirdly similar, right, to Valtio. Here's my particular thought on it. When I kind of looked up like the comparison, I think it's just which syntax you prefer.
Right, I think, well, this is using observable pattern, and then yours is, Valtio, if I understand it, our
Yeah.
Valtio uses proxies as the like underlying.
Well, okay, so the underlying implementation is different. I agree with you, but from a tactile perspective of how you kind of use it in your app, it's like from a functionality perspective, I think if you really prefer one underlying implementation over the other, but from a practical perspective, it's really what syntax you prefer. It's very rare that like one wouldn't satisfy the use case where the other would.
I guess one I'm thinking is like if you're using, I guess microfrontends where you need to go across kind of boundaries, is that something where Valtio would have problems with? I guess.
No, because the proxies are just occur in plain JavaScript. One of the benefits of Valtio is like you can simply do updates and subscriptions in plain JavaScript that are not bound to React, which means if you have other like I've seen in one company where they were moving from like jQuery-esque and then implementing React. But the nice thing is because they could bind to it in plain JavaScript, they could actually read and write from it in plain JavaScript land and just plain jQuery. So it kind of is the only part of it that is React specific at all in reality is just the useSnapshot hook, right? Because everything else is just plain JavaScript.
Yeah. Any questions?
About your example where you use a snapshot in the component and then you display a state.name, I think. If you had
Can I show you different ones?
when you rent this one, for instance, yes.
Okay.
So if you had a more, if you accessed, if you access the properties dynamically, does it screw up a bit the
When you mean dynamically, would it be like if I needed to access it in like a click handler or something like that? That's not in just the immediate render.
No, I mean if you access the property dynamically with.
Oh, okay. Like whether it was name or role is dynamic.
Yes.
It still keeps track of it. It still works. Like depending, like even if it's at the actual execution time, right? At that point, whichever one is called, even if that key is determined dynamically in the code, it still has to execute on one or the other, so it's still keeping track of it. And if that causes sometimes you to look at one and look at the other, that's fine. It'll just keep track of two. Yeah, so I've had that use case and it works fine.
It didn't cause any excessive or rendering, or it didn't cause a render to be missed, for instance?
No, because it's kind of keeping track of like somehow that component tree, and if you change which property you're accessing and you're not accessing the first property, it actually unsubscribes from the first property. Which I'll be honest with you, that was a bug. It didn't do that at one point, and then they fixed it. So that was a bug a while back. Yeah, you could probably look up the GitHub issue somewhere, but it wasn't recent, it was a while back. Yeah. Yeah. Cool, anything else? Awesome. I guess we're right on time too. So thank you guys. Hopefully this is useful. I'm always curious. I'm sure if you guys do end up using it, let me know. I'm not like, I'm somewhat of a fan of the library obviously, but not everyone's experience is the same. So if you guys have trouble with it, like feel free to drop me a note and let me know. Also happy to help if you guys are like, hey, how do we do this? Because we want to try it. All right, thank you very much.